people's heads and any part of the body normally covered with hair. Prisoners walked out of there looking like they had been scalped. They were splattered with blood. I remember a rabbi who was being transported along with us. His entire life's meaning seemed to be concentrated in his beard. The old man hung on to his beard like this, but they shaved him as well, and he walked out bleeding like the rest of us.
At the transit camp, we were sorted. The so-called merchants arrived from the taiga. The merchants were what we called the camp bosses. They lined us up, and then each one of them would look into our faces, lift our chins.
These so-called merchants would come and select us, slave laborers, according to the professional descriptions in our files. Some would go to a factory, others would go to a construction project, a digging site, or a logging camp.
After that, we were sent out into the taiga. The taiga is everything beyond kilometer 72 on the highway. The Kolyma highway was built entirely by hand, without any mechanization. That's why they say that the highway was built on bones.
I ended up at a penalty mining camp. It was a gold mine named Upper Yevon. We were hauled for 700 kilometers in unheated trucks.
The Kolyma camps were part of a huge network of camps. Kolyma is larger than many European countries, like France or Germany. The highway branched off in places where there were rich deposits of gold and tin. There are reports that prisoners at Butugachak, a bleak mining camp, mined uranium.
All of those years, we were hungry, cold, and loaded down with impossible physical labor. Forestry, digging, breaking rock. In other words, we returned to the barracks so weakened, knowing that at 5 o'clock in the morning, they would bang on the rails again, which meant that we would have to wake up for roll call, and we would have to line up and put on our wet clothes that hadn't dried out from the previous day and go back out to the woods.
In the morning, you'd hear the banging on the rails. Everyone would jump up. The guards would herd the prisoners out of their bunks and outside. The prisoners got beaten or kicked, and then they were lined up to go to work.
And we were forced to wash gold like this, in a trough. When all the water in Kolyma had already frozen. You can pan for ore only when there is water. But up on the hill we had these giant containers, like the top portion of the ore wagons. We used them to melt snow by starting fires. We used this icy water to wash gold ore out in the cold weather. Our hands were all covered with fat blisters and big bloody cracks in the skin. And if you didn't meet your quota, if you didn't get 1.5 kilos of this tin concentrate, you wouldn't be allowed to go back to camp. You had to spend the entire 24 hours out in the cold.
Но вместе с тем я хочу сказать, что природа...
Nature was also working against us, because all we had to do was stop working for 1 minute and we would freeze.
Замерзает. И вот мы должны...
So we had to squeeze the last drop of effort out of ourselves. At least it would keep us warm.
Но это нас согревает.
It was a two-man operation. One man used a pickaxe to break up the frozen soil, and then he would fill the wheelbarrow. The other one would run the wheelbarrow over to the equipment. If you met your 100 wheelbarrow quota, fine. You could go back to the camp and receive your normal food ration.
Most of all, we dug mine shafts. But before we dug the shafts, we had to conduct exploratory digs. 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters. But you've got to realize that this is a permafrost region. Permafrost. We were working with stone, granite. All the labor was done by hand with pickaxes. All the debris had to be removed by hand. This was exhausting labor. The picks had to be sharpened and hardened, yet they never were.
Hundreds of people died while carting wheelbarrows. No, not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands. For the first ironclad law of Dalstroy was, don't bother coming back to the barracks without 100 wheelbarrows.
The camp criminals lived at the expense of the political prisoners. In other words, the political prisoners did the actual labor, while the criminals, who often didn't do any work, divided up the work quota points among themselves.
The criminals didn't walk at all. The men had to cart wheelbarrows with ore around the side, and the criminals used to sing a little ditty. Wheelbarrow, wheelbarrow, don't you fear, I won't touch you or come near.
The criminals were obviously a lowly bunch of people. They despised those of us convicted of political crimes. They called us enemies of the people. If they liked a jacket or pants that we were wearing, they would make us give it up.
The criminal world placed a high premium on good storytellers. They even loved people who could read poems. Someone asked if I knew any poems by Yesenin. I read a few poems from memory. That was enough to keep the thieves from robbing me for at least another 2 days.
People worked themselves to their last ounce of strength. Even if a person ate a normal food ration, the amount he consumed would not make up or compensate for the energy that he used up at work.
The prisoners were fed balanda, a mysterious bouillon made of potato leaves or maybe beet leaves. There wasn't an ounce of fat in it.
Bread was sacred in camp, and no one had any right to steal another person's bread. A thief could steal or confiscate anything else, but not bread. Anyone who stole bread could be killed.
What does it mean when a hunk of bread becomes the basic currency of your life? A hunk of bread, a hunk of bread. People were willing to do all kinds of things just to get their hands on a hunk of bread.
Вот он, значит, уже мертвый, значит, но когда происходит
A person was already dead, but when the convicts were counted, this was done once in the morning and once in the evening. People were so hungry that there were times when a corpse was not declared dead, so his neighbors could somehow, miraculously, get the dead man's portion.
Психика человека, склад человека, разные, кто...
Different people have different psyches. Some could tolerate it. Others couldn't. Some prisoners would look for any way possible, anything just to avoid that damned mine, that damn logging site, the damn tarring operation for railroad ties, that lime pit, or any other kind of heavy labor. These people invented all kinds of methods to injure themselves. If someone worked in a mine, he might find a discarded explosive charge. He would light the fuse with a cigarette, lift his arm, and blow off half a hand. Anything to avoid heavy labor.
Many people just accepted the faith and tried to survive from one day to the next. Many climbed up into themselves. You couldn't talk to them. And as I said, there were many who had faith, they were praying.
If a person had to carry around a wheelbarrow, there was no question that he would wear himself out to death within one season. That's how people died. We had massive outbreaks of what is technically called alimentary dystrophy. The Russian word for such unfortunates was dochodyaga. Dochodyaga, or walking corpse, is a word that exists only in the Russian language. These were people who were totally famished.
These prisoners, the goners who scavenged for scraps of food in the waste dumps, who couldn't tolerate their hunger pangs, who had to eat something, anything, were as good as dead, dead, dead. Up to 40 of them every day.
As a rule, there would be 2 or 3 complete crew turnovers every season. In other words, only the crew chief would survive. The crew chief was, of course, well fed. He didn't work.
Our group, the prisoners from Moscow, consisted of 517 people. We were transferred to Ustamlag in October 1938. By March 1939, only 22 people were left alive. All the rest died within the first winter alone.
Sometimes in winter, a burial might consist of just throwing a little bit of dirt on a corpse and then letting the snow cover it up. In summer, the bones would re-emerge from the earth. Once enough corpses had piled up, they'd either be bulldozed or else thrown into a hole that was blown open by explosives.
When the guard filled out a report on the burial, he wouldn't say that the corpse had a name, like Ivan Ivanovich Ivanov. Instead, he would write down a certain designated number, such as M3720. This number, M3720, was then stenciled into a tin can using a hammer and nail. Usually the perforated number would appear on the lid, but sometimes people would go to all the trouble of cutting apart the whole can, thereby leaving more room for the inscription. This piece of metal was attached by wire to the foot, and that was proof that a certain person, M3720, was buried right there under the hill. I can still hear the sound of this piece of wire and can lid tinkling in the wind.
And all during this time, of course, we were missing our loved ones. I didn't know that my husband had been shot. All I knew was that he had been arrested. I found out later.
Надо создать такие, значит, лозунги.
So I was given jobs painting slogans and posters. Slogans like, "Shock work is the path to liberation," or "Liberation through honest toil." And whose quotations were these? The words of our great father. So I had to make a portrait of him as well. I did a good job of painting him. His portrait came out well.
I knew that I was in a race against Stalin. I was convinced that as long as Stalin was alive, I would be kept in camp. I would weigh my chances. I'm younger, he's older. My living conditions are worse. On the other hand, he ate and drank too much for a man his age. In other words, I constantly calculated the odds.
Some of my friends and comrades in misery had hope. This can't last long. This can't last 25 years, they would say. But I felt, no, we're here for good. As long as Stalin is alive, we'll be here. He will drive us into the grave. And we thought that he would live 100 years or more. After all, he came from the Caucasus. Yes, the people from the Caucasus live forever.
So I finally made it to that day in March, when all of a sudden we heard this heavenly music on the loudspeakers. Bach, Handel, Beethoven. And then we heard the health announcement. I remember how we all ran to the camp infirmary and demanded that the doctors discuss this among themselves and tell us what we could hope for. So the chief doctor, his assistant, and the male nurse, all of whom were convicts, of course, went into the banya to hold their meeting. Meanwhile, we're all huddled in the changing room, our teeth chattering with anticipation. They met for about 20 minutes. Then the chief doctor walked out. He was a professor, a very well-educated man. He was beaming, and he said, "You guys, the bastard is finished. No hope for him." And we began kissing one another.
I didn't just cry. I thought that our lives would collapse. How could we live without Stalin? I bawled my heart out. I wasn't just crying. I sobbed for several hours. Cried and cried. Because I never blamed him for anything. The idea never crossed my mind. You know, many people thought that he didn't know anything about what was happening. But in spite of everything, I thought, well, no matter what, this must be just another mistake.
I said, "This is my freedom." Even though I wasn't released for another 2.5 years, I knew that I was a free man. Beginning March 5th, 1953, there hasn't been a single March 5th when I haven't gotten drunk.
But within a week, everything changed. Everything changed.
When I was arrested, I was 30. I was 47 when I was released. In other words, they took away the most delicious piece of my life, the fillet of life.
Most of us were in our 30s when we were arrested in 1937. We thought, God, somewhere out there, it's still possible to be a woman, to love, to be beautiful. Someone, somewhere, still dances. But we were just robots.
People often ask me this question: why did you survive? I cannot answer that question, just like a person who survived a war cannot answer. Why did he survive? His comrades perished, and he remained alive. Why? This is an unforeseeable, unplanned, incomprehensible combination of factors, including luck, character, health, many things.
I had one leg in the grave and somehow managed to pull myself out by my balding hair. I clung to life. And I believed that the sun would still shine on me.
God chose me to go through these nightmares in order to record what happened. And I told God, if my sufferings were not in vain, I only want to leave some traces of what happened. Not traces for myself. I am a modest person. I just want people to know what kind of suffering there was.
The people who wrote their memoirs of camp life realized that if the KGB ever found those manuscripts, either as a result of a search or because someone informed on them, they would be arrested again. Even so, they wrote their memoirs. They told the stories of their comrades, many of whom died.
I was asked by people who were on their last legs inside the camps. They called me different nicknames. Nikolka, they would say, or, hey, Brushman, remember all of this. Maybe you'll survive. Tell people about it. Illustrate it. Show it in your art. Make drawings of everything.
This memorial isn't only for those of us who were able to return home and survive to this day. The memorial is also for all of those who perished here in Kolyma. For my brother who was shot, for my husband who died, and for me, the only one who survived.
Я помню тот Ванинский порт, и рев пароходов угрюмый, как шли мы по трапу на борт. В холодные мрачные трюмы. Будь проклята ты, Колыма, что названа чудной планетой, сойдешь поневоле с ума. Отсюда возврата уж нету.
Tomorrow night on WETA, join us for Ken Burns' latest film, as this WETA production uses footage from archives and newsreels to look at the life and career of America's greatest architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. That's Wednesday beginning at 8. But now stay with us for an encore performance of Get Healthy Now with Gary Null next on WETA.
Stolen Years has been made possible by the contributions of these organizations and individuals.